I don't know what you're talking about. I'm talking
Obviously
about.
You don't, because this is the fact.
Charlie, I would like to be very specific here.
I was just very specific.
So I'm talking about the GI Bill, which allowed people who had served in our wars, including a lot of Black Americans, to come back and
No, you're talking about redlining, right? So this is redlining.
No, this is connected to redlining.
No, which one do you want to talk about, GI Bill or redlining?
If you allow me to explain, this is connected to redlining.
Okay.
I guess you don't understand that, but I'm happy to explain it to you right now if you just let me get this out. I promise you it'll be worth the effort. The GI Bill gave low-interest loans to people who had served in the war, right? And those loans were issued they were federally backed loans. So the banks would issue to people at a low interest rate so that they could buy homes and generate what we now understand to be the basis of middle-class wealth in this country. What ended up happening was the process of redlining was that banks said, oh, we're only going to issue loans for you to buy in certain neighborhoods.
Right, Black banks.
All banks.
Right, so why did Black banks do that?
The overwhelming majority of issuers in this country...
No, you got to answer the question. Why did Black banks do that?
I will answer your question. But what I'm talking about is the overwhelming majority of issuers, just like today, even more so back then, the overwhelming majority of issuers were white-owned banks. And those banks redlined communities where they said, we will not issue to people who live in these communities. Now, what ended up happening, what that meant for Black people, was because of what's called a restrictive covenant, which meant that in the covenant that attached to the land for a lease, many of them precluded Black people from buying in those neighborhoods. So basically what happened was banks would only lend to people and give those low-interest loans to people who were allowed to live in white neighborhoods, which meant that systemically, Black people weren't able to take advantage of that same low-interest loan program that enabled so many white people who ordinarily would not have been able to afford a house because they fought and served in our wars to do so. Now, how many Black banks are in America, and how many Black banks were in America in the 1960s,
If there's even one
Charlie?
example, that's the question.
No, because
Blacks were discriminating against themselves, and whites were being discriminated more than Asian Americans.
This is what's so fascinating.
No, let me answer this question. Why was
Did you want me to answer your question about
Well,
Black
you're not.
bank
You're dodging and you're dancing.
No, I'm happy to.
Very bluntly.
Let the record reflect that I'm happy to answer your question about Black owners. My point is that
answer the question.
You see, I had a gentleman talk to me about Charlie Kirk over this weekend. And he was a fan of Charlie Kirk. But in our little slight discussion, I expressed to him, no one should have died that way, but I disagree with almost everything that Charlie Kirk says and the way he does it and what he has done to this country. Charlie Kirk is not a hero in this country because he has created more division. And that conversation demonstrates exactly how he created more division within this country. Because now more and more people are walking around thinking that what he was saying in that video would be correct. That Black banks discriminated against Black people, and that is the cause of why the Black social economic situation is what it is today, which is a direct connection to crime in Black America today. But they won't see the truth, which you notice how he tried to overtalk her and fast talk her into not dealing with the situation by which she brought up. So let me bring it to you a little bit slower so that for all those Charlie Kirk followers who are on my pages, so that you can understand it correctly, since I've seen you recently been making a lot more comments than normal. The GI Bill, when it was first started after World War II, was started so that military families would be able to buy houses as the growth of great America, right? This was part of the New Deal that FDR put out. Now, as part of this program, and I know today y'all think GI Bill going to college and it's VA loans that get you into these houses. But back then it was the GI Bill, 1940s. In the 1940s, there were only 9 Black banks that survived the Great Depression. Of the 137 banks, larger banks that was in America, only 9 of them were Black banks. Those 9 Black banks did not have enough what you call credit in their banks in order to facilitate loaning to all of Black America. So if you don't understand how banking works, every dollar that you put in a bank, every dollar that you put into a bank, that bank then has the ability to loan that same dollar out 1 to 20 times, depending upon the level of deposits that are held by that bank. So a bank like Bank of America, which would hold billions and trillions of dollars in deposits on any given day, can loan out $1 20 times. Smaller banks that only hold in, say, $10 billion or $500 million may only be able, based on the charters and the rules and so on and so forth, to loan $1 out 5 times. So there's a huge difference in the capabilities of a bank based on the amount of deposits that it holds. Now, banks are also under rules that would tell them that they can only carry so many riskier loans or so many loans in certain areas, so certain industries. So, like if you go to the bank and you want to open a gym, there's only so many that's considered high risk. So there's only so many of those loans they will carry, even if you have like a great plan. Adult industry, alcohol, liquor, there's only so many loans they can carry in those industries. But they also have to do their risk assessment for every loan. And there's only so many riskier loans that they're going to carry. So that's how banking works in a very slight, minimal nutshell as far as home loans are concerned. Now, what happened with the GI Bill is they came out and they said, well, we're going to redline these communities. So the overwhelming Black communities were redlined, and the thing was that they're not going to give loans, or at least the prime rate loans, to the people who live in those communities. And we're not going to, and if they do buy a house within those communities, we're going to give them a much higher rate for living in there and for buying houses in there. So if you wanted to get a house in a lower prime, with a lower prime that it makes it affordable, then you had to go and buy the house in a non-red line area, which was usually a white community. If now the problem was, especially in places like where in the Southeast, where the majority of Black people have always lived because of slavery, then most of those white communities, you cannot buy a house in those communities. And if you were to buy a house in some of those communities, most likely that you're going to have a cross burning in your yard, or your house is going to get burned down, or you may get murdered. So then what happens is that Black people, soldiers who returned, who had the access to it, the overwhelming majority could not buy a house in their community. And so then later on, as regentrification begins to happen, white people buy the houses in that community and then rent them out to the Black people who couldn't buy the house in the first place. So middle income wealth is never generated or is minimized. And this creates a situation where impoverishment becomes a normative within a community, instead of the average increase of the child doing 10 to 20% better than the parent. In this situation, the child either does the same as the parent, lower than the parent, or very slightly better than the parent. This is why you go into many communities, Black communities, you will see that the children live across the street, next door, around the corner, but within that same community, and that the housing, the level of housing, the value of the housing hardly ever increases because it's been redlined into these areas and people have been packed into it. So unlike a structured ghetto, it is a community ghetto that is forcibly created simply because you don't allow for home ownership, which is the thing that allows for families to be able to, oh, your kid want to go to school, we can put a second mortgage on the house. You want to start a business, you can put a second mortgage on a house. It affords that ability to build wealth. And this is what happened in Black America through the 1940s, all the way up into 1976. There were only 50 Black-owned banks, and the overwhelming majority of banks are still white-owned banks who refuse to give home ownership loans to Black people. So when Charlie Kirk tried to present this as a Black-on Black problem, he is completely excluding the fact that it was white banks who created the idea, white banks who regulated it, white banks who redlined it, the government who also instituted this redlining, as well as running the U.S. highway system straight through Black communities, especially if the Black community was doing well. They would run the U.S. highway system right through that community. Those are the talking points that he likes to exclude and try to make it seem like it was something that Black people did or did not do to create the situation that Black people are suffering through up until this day, still and feel the effects of, I should say. And so when you come and you say that he was right, no, he was dead ass wrong. It's the misconstruing of the information. And I'm going to talk about the crime rate in the next video, because it's always interesting how what I'm going to talk about in the next video is always missed out. It's never talked about when it comes to crime, when Charlie Kirk was y'all leader. So you have a great day, and always remember, you have to free yourself to be yourself, because your greatness is non-negotiable. Good journey, good vibrations.